I always have lots of fun with these things, so please be patient. Good, it's working. Basically, this is just for information's sake to be complete. The agricultural nitrogen fertilizers, I'm sure you all know, but just to review them, there's granulated dry, urea and ammonium sulfate are probably the more common ones. There's gas, anhydrous ammonia. How many of you do use anhydrous on your corn? Couple? And then liquid, there's also like 2800 and 150020 are common liquid fertilizers, but because it's irrigation and because of the potential for leaching, I would suspect that those are less popular under irrigated fields. So what's a nitrogen fertilizer additive? Well, it's a substance that you add to a fertilizer to extend the period that a particular form of N remains in the soil. What we're trying to do is reduce losses, and by picking on maintaining the fertilizer in a certain form in the soil, we try to reduce those losses. So what they do is they inhibit the processes of the N cycle that put your nitrogen into a form that is more vulnerable. It doesn't prevent the process, just inhibits it. And these products usually are added to dry fertilizer during the manufacture, or they can be added to a liquid fertilizer after it's manufactured. And because we're trying to prevent losses, we focus on the main loss mechanisms, so that's volatilization, denitrification, and leaching. Do you all know what those things are? Good, because I don't want to explain them. So what are the nitrogen fertilizer additives doing? Well, the purpose we're trying to do is to reduce nutrient movement, nitrogen movement into fields in the surrounding landscape. And there's basically two kinds of additives that are used. One is a nitrification inhibitor. There's two of those. And then there's urease inhibitors, which, like agrotane, is the most common one. And what that does is reduces the risk of volatilization losses of urea. Now, these products don't guarantee a maximum yield can be produced with lower N rates. I know farmers like to try and take advantage of things like that, but that's not really what the product is trying to do. We're trying to give you protection from significant loss. So if there is no significant loss, that condition doesn't occur with the weather, then the benefit of using that is probably minimal. But if you have a weather event that makes the fertilizer vulnerable to loss, that's where you could have benefit. So why is this important for corn production? Well, corn's a long season crop. It's in the field for a long time. I remember last year I was out looking at a field of corn with Travis, and shucks, that corn had a long way to go, and we were in August. And it's kind of a little bit of a psychological barrier that I had to deal with. Corn also has a very high nitrogen requirement. So products like these that safeguard it from loss have a potential for gain on these kinds of crops. And then lastly, most of that corn is irrigated, and so it has a high moisture status, so there's a greater risk of nitrogen losses under that situation. I want to talk a little bit about ammonia volatilization from urea. What happens when urea is broken down by the urease enzyme? Well, what you're doing is converting urea, which is not available to the crop in that form. And it's then converted to ammonia and carbamic acid, which continues to be converted to more ammonia. Now, urease is the enzyme that's present in plant residues, and so it's not going to be, it's very common in the environment, and you can't avoid it. It's going to be there, and it's going to cause that urea to gas off. And when you get that urea converting to ammonia is when you have vulnerability to loss, because ammonia being a gas, it can escape into the atmosphere, but it's very reactive, and anyone who has used anhydrous ammonia knows how the dangers associated with that product and how it reacts very violently to chemically to form the ammonium. So if we have urea that we're broadcasting on the surface, how can we prevent its loss? Well, there's a thing called a urease inhibitor that you add to it, which inhibits the process of conversion of urea to ammonia, and that reduces the risk of loss of gaseous ammonia from calcareous soils. Calcareous soils have a fairly high pH, and in that environment, the ammonia is more vulnerable to gassing off. And so that's why on our soils here at Outlook, which tend to be calcareous for the most part, we have risk of gaseous losses of ammonia from broadcast urea. Now I want to go over some of the different higher value products of nitrogen that are available to farmers. SuperU has been around for a few years. It's about $150 a ton premium to conventional urea. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, I don't know, I think I'd be willing to take the risk on using just ordinary urea and not paying the extra money for the protection that the nitrification and urease inhibitors add to the product. But I was quite surprised by the project I did about the results we got, and made me have second thoughts about that. So this particular product, it inhibits conversion of ammonium to nitrate, as well as conversion of urea to ammonia. Another product that's commonly available, it's manufactured by Yara, and it's a little bit lower N content and has some sulfur in it. What its benefit is that theoretically, because of that ammonium sulfate in the blend, in the product, it neutralizes some of the pH effect of the urea. So theoretically, it should provide some protection and increase or reduce the risk of losses of nitrogen from that product. Researchers have tried to demonstrate this process being effective for reducing losses of nitrogen. However, the research that's been done so far has not been successful in identifying that. But I also know that the researcher that worked with this product over a course of number of years had difficulty showing that it provided the benefit that was promoted. Another enhanced efficiency product is ESN, Extra Smart Nitrogen. It's a little bit lower content in N because of the weight of the coating that protects the urea prill, and that polymer coating that prevents the urea from absorbing moisture. When it's warm enough and moist enough, it's going to allow the urea that's in that prill to dissolve and move out into the soil and become available for transformation and become available to plants. Here's a overview of the nitrogen cycle, and I just tried to show with this pictorial of the nitrogen cycle where the different products that we're using work. Most of the products are involved in trying to reduce the risk of nitrification occurring, and also like the only exception really is SuperU, which has an effect on the denitrifying bacteria that cause gaseous losses of nitrogen, of nitrate converting into N2O gases. Now let's talk a little bit about ammonia volatilization by urease. It occurs when the ammonium forming fertilizer is surface applied and not incorporated. If you band it, or if you cultivate to incorporate the urea, it's going to be interacting with the soil and not be subject to losses. So what happens when urea is broadcast on the surface? It's hydrolyzed to ammonium carbonate, and that ammonium carbonate converts spontaneously and very quickly to ammonia gas. That ammonia gas on the surface of the soil can be lost to the atmosphere quite readily, but ammonia has a very strong affinity for moisture, and so if your soil is moist, that ammonia will be converted very quickly to ammonium, and once it's in the ammonium form, it's quickly absorbed onto the soil colloids, so the humus, the organic matter, or the clays that are in the soil. They latch onto that product and keep it safe. Urea losses are promoted by, if the urea is sitting on the surface of the ground, if you have a higher wind speed, it increases your losses. If you have a lower moisture content, it'll increase your losses. If your soil pH is very high, it's more likely then that the ammonia can form from the urea. And also, if it's very high temperature, that promotes your losses as well. So how do we control that? Well, banding the fertilizer will reduce its risk for loss because it's not exposed to the surface. But what these products are trying to do is save you labor. So that's why we broadcast them, and then hope the agents that you've added to that fertilizer give you chance for that weather conditions to, say, some rainfall, or you can irrigate. It gives you a chance to get those products into the ground within a reasonable period of time. Under irrigation, we're usually broadcasting these products at quite high rates, and I would say that if you're applying a rate of 100 pounds of N or higher, that's when your risk of losses is higher, and that's when it's more likely that these products will provide benefit. These losses, of course, decline when the weather is cooler. Spring days are often more ideal for that, but it's not uncommon for April to turn into some 80-degree days either. And in the outlook area, we have soils that are medium textured for the most part. If they're sandier, those are lower cation exchange capacity soils, and your risk of loss then is higher, and they might provide more benefit under that situation. Talk a little bit about nitrification. That's the process where the ammonium is converted to nitrate. These are encouraged. This process happens quicker when it's warmer, when your soil is nice and moist, and when your pH is moderate. I would say moderately high. Those things encourage it. But if it's dry soil or if it's waterlogged, then that stops this particular process. I've always been intrigued by the fact that when you grow rice, we don't grow much rice here, but if your soils are waterlogged, that stops this process and makes it irrelevant for the situation. The nitrification inhibitors, there's basically 2 of them that are commonly marketed in the area. Dicyanidamide. It inhibits an enzyme that converts ammonium to nitrate. Another common one that's usually used with anhydrous ammonia is N-Serve, and what it does is it kills bacteria, and that's how it provides the inhibition of nitrification. Now, the benefit of these products has been varied among different soil textures, soil types, so it's really difficult to make general comments on that. In terms of another class of protecting additives you could add are Urease Inhibitors, which prevent the conversion of urea to ammonia. There's basically 7 here, but really in our marketplace, the main one would be Agritane, which is the first one on the list there, and I'll just try and show you what kind of losses are possible. This data is taken from a rice field in Arkansas, and you may say, well, that has no relevance to our situation. But what I'm trying to show with this picture, with this chart, is that ammonium sulfate is less vulnerable to loss than urea. Urea is the one that is most vulnerable. And this chart shows how if you add these additives to the fertilizer, it will reduce the risk of loss for loss of ammonia. So when would you use these products, these urease inhibitors? When you are unable to immediately incorporate the urea into the ground. If you leave it on the surface, that's when these things can provide benefit. So it allows you to wait for time to get incorporation from irrigation or rainfall. And what happens when the rainfall happens is that the ammonium grabs onto a hydrogen atom from the soil to form ammonium. And then it makes it not susceptible to loss. So now we're back to probably the most interesting thing about the project we did this past year. We had a project that was sponsored by Koch Fertilizers where we broadcast 4 different products on the surface of the soil. The products included bare urea, Agritane treated urea, Additives, and SuperU. And these products were broadcast onto the surface of the soil. The farmer then seeded with a bore-grow air seeder. I wouldn't describe it as a high disturbance seeding operation, but that would have provided some incorporation. And then he irrigated the site to try and get the canola out of the ground and put the fertilizer into the soil. The PK&S soil fertilizer was applied at seeding time, down the mid-row bander, and the canola was, Joel and I had to be very patient waiting for this crop to be taken off. It wasn't harvested until the end of September. But the interesting thing was the SuperU provided about a 10 bushel per acre yield response for over the bare urea, which was, I had not realized how successful this product would have been in increasing the yield. Now, it does cost about $150 a ton higher than bare urea, so that's a management decision, but the product does do what they claim it does. For 2019, Joel and I have been able to get funding from Adopt to do another project this coming growing season with Broadcast N. We upped the ante and added a few more treatments, so you needed a lot more land, but we put the N on at a little bit lower rate, 125 pounds of N, and we used bare urea, Agritane treated urea, Additives, Agritane treated Additives, and SuperU, and we're going to also add a spring applied treatment where we're putting down 125 pounds of N with Urea banded in the soil. And so we'll compare these 6 treatments next fall and see whether we can get as strong a differentiation of the treatments as we did this year. Just want to thank Scott Anderson and his staff at the RAC for their assistance with this project and acknowledge the funding from Adopt. So that's what I have to say about enhanced efficiency fertilizers. Any questions?
How long does the fertilizer stay on the surface if you don't get rain? Like, can you leave it, will it be there till next year with that agrotane or not?
No. It's that agrotane, I would say, is active for maybe 10 days.
Okay.
It has a limited lifespan.
Okay.
It doesn't last forever.
Okay.
So all it does is provide an added window for rainfall or irrigation to dissolve the fertilizer and bring it down into the soil.
So if you don't get that rain in 10 days, that fertilizer is kind of a waste, or it's kind of
a lot of it will volatilize, yes.
Okay.
Would there be any benefit of mineral banding any of the fertilizers? Put them in the ground?
Certainly. Banding has long been used as a means of protecting nitrogen fertilizer from loss. We've always thought that it was in the ground, it was safe. There's recent research from Montana that shows that even if it's within 2 inches of the surface of the soil, that there is a potential for a certain amount of volatilization loss of urea. But banding certainly gives you added protection against loss.
So on that comment, your spring banding that you're doing this spring, how deep are you putting it down?
We haven't discussed that with the farmer yet. I would say it would be fairly shallow.
Oh.
Whatever he considers he wants it to do.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for your questions. I've enjoyed sharing my project with you, and I appreciate your attention.
Okay, thanks, Gary.